overflowing. But there's the rub. The prison population has gotten so huge, there is tremendous pressure to release some inmates early. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, parole and every other form of early release makes some people absolutely crazy. People like Lauren Van Bischler, for example. Lauren is the 8th of 9 rape victims of a Portland, Oregon serial rapist who began his spree just 14 hours after he was released on parole. Louise Spears' daughter, Denise, was brutally murdered by a drug-addicted parolee, while Donna Cuomo's brother, Joey, was just 17 years old when he was murdered by an infamous parolee named Willie Horton, a man who later raped and tortured another couple while out on prison furlough. Joe represents the other side of this story. He's an ex-con who committed aggravated assault and burglary when he was out on parole. Our next guest, let's call him Jack, is a model parolee. Jack served 17 years on a murder rap. Some say the system that allowed Joe and Jack and the others out of prison early is the best there can be under the circumstances. But other people, like these victims, plead for the system to be completely overhauled. Parole horror stories, prison, parole, tragedy. That's the focus of this edition of Geraldo. Start right out with some statistics. First, on the total prison population and the total population of people who are being released on parole right now. In prison today, or as of June of '89 rather, 673,000 people. Well over 400,000 are out on parole. Now I want to go back to 1986, which is the last full year for which statistics are available. We're going to break it down to see what happened to those people who gained an early release from prison. In 1986, as you can see, there were almost 200,000 total parolees. Of that number, slightly more than half were successful. The bad news is that over 35% had something bad happen out on parole. They either skipped out, they committed new crimes, or their parole was revoked. Well over 35%. Well over 1/3 of every early release had an unhappy ending. Early release from prison is obviously something that irks lots of people. It costs some of them their lives. Take a look.
I ran because I knew if I stuck around, that the police would try to get me involved in any kind of way because I just got out of prison. Been out of prison about 3 weeks when this happened.
It happened in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1983. The victim was 24-year-old Wanda Jean Lopez, stabbed to death in a robbery attempt. 4 witnesses placed 24-year-old parolee Carlos De Luna at the scene. They say she begged him for mercy. On parole at the time for attempted rape, De Luna was convicted for the murder and eventually was put to death by lethal injection. Faced with chronic overcrowding in the prisons, officials often opt to parole inmates early or give them a furlough, 3 days to leave the watchful eyes of prison life.
The Massachusetts furlough program was unique. It was the only one in the nation that furloughed murderers who had not served enough time to be eligible for parole. The federal program doesn't do that. No other state programs do that.
In last year's presidential race, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis was probably defeated because of his state's program granting furlough to prisoners, including murderers serving life sentence without parole. A year earlier, in 1987, convicted murderer Willie Horton Jr. went on a weekend furlough and escaped. Horton then took a Maryland couple hostage, torturing Clifford Barnes and raping and terrorizing his wife for over 12 hours.
There's never been even an apology test for what happened to us. Whenever it's been brought up, it's been accused of being an aberration or one failure in a successful system, which is a blatant lie.
According to a survey conducted in June by the Florida Department of Corrections, at least 40% of the estimated 9,000 inmates released in 1985 were back behind bars or placed back on probation. within their first 3 years of freedom.
He will be taken alive if he doesn't offer any resistance. We're not out to kill him. We'll try to take him alive if at all possible, but we aren't going to jeopardize any officers' lives in order to do that.
Ex-convict Michael Wayne Jackson of Wright City, Missouri had a record a mile long, including more than 30 arrests for crimes like rape and robbery and assault with intent to kill. He was the target of a widespread manhunt by FBI agents and state troopers. Started after he killed his federal parole officer with a bullet to the head. He killed 2 other people and abducted 6 others.
I'm real nervous, especially when I come to work this morning.
I know I slept with a loaded gun last night. I live out in the country, and my kids are all scared. My wife's a nervous wreck.
The crazed gunman finally ended the search when he put a bullet in his own head. But in all these cases, and hundreds, perhaps thousands of others, we have to wonder why. Why would the system release a man like Jackson or Horton back into society? Are we closing our eyes to an inevitability that some people are so bad, letting them out early only increases the threat they pose to the rest of us? Donna, when your brother Joey was killed, and you found out that his murderer was a parolee, did that make it worse?
Well, basically, yes, because you said, why did they leave him out of jail early? He obviously wasn't rehabilitated. He was had been convicted of attempted murder, and then he's out early. He served 3 years of the 9-year sentence. And basically, that's what's been happening all across this country. Criminals aren't even serving the minimum time. They are being given basically a third of the sentence that the public thinks that they're receiving.
Obviously, your brother was killed by the infamous Willie Horton, made infamous, or his notoriety rather, comes from his becoming such an issue in the presidential race. After murdering Joey, and after being sentenced to life in prison without parole in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, he was granted a furlough. He ran away to Maryland, where he did this awful thing to the couple there, torturing the man and raping the woman. Was that a surprise to you, your reaction to the fact that he went and did it again?
We don't have the death penalty in Massachusetts, so life with no parole, we assume, meant that you're going to spend your life in jail. That's what, a sentence should mean, what it says, and obviously it doesn't. What happens is the governor, with the power of commutation, was commuting the sentences of first and second degree murderers. And part of the process in receiving a commutation would be to have them go on furloughs or work detail. And so Horton, after serving only 10 years, was on furloughs.
Do you think the state was an accomplice then to the rape that followed your brother's murder?
Well, I think the state obviously it plays a big part in taking the the guilt in this, because these laws are definitely leaving the public at jeopardy.
This is obviously a very controversial issue. There are 2 sides to this story. In addition to the guests who are here to defend or object to the present system, first meet one who is here to defend the system, Mario Paparozzi. I hope I pronounce it right, from the New Jersey Parole Board. Also to defend the system is Selden Hale, a Texas criminal attorney. In opposition to the system, in addition to the victims, is Catherine Abadi. She is chairperson of the New York State Crime Victims Board and other crime victims who are gathered here in the studio, as I indicated earlier. Let me go via satellite now to Portland, Oregon, to Lauren Van Bischler. Lauren, you were the 8th of 9 rape victims of a serial rapist who began his rampage just 14 hours after being released on parole. To the extent that you feel comfortable, can you tell us briefly what happened to you?
Sure. I had gone to sleep early on a Sunday night, getting ready for my work day, and I'd heard a sound in my basement and just assumed it was my cats, which I keep in the wintertime, and went back to sleep. And then I heard a creak out in my hallway outside my bedroom door, and I kind of looked over my shoulder and here's a man silhouetted in my bedroom door with a crowbar over his head. And the minute he saw I was awake, he zoomed into my bedroom and told me to lie still and not make a sound. He disguised his voice. And then from then on, it's history. He assaulted me.
When you found you were one of 9 victims, did that make it worse?
Compared to what?
Really, I guess, yeah, such a stupid question. What about when you found out he was on parole, just 14 hours free?
It didn't surprise me at all.
Why not?
Parolees committing crimes over and over again it's just an old story. And the way this fellow moved in and so forth, I just assumed that he knew what he was doing, that he'd gone to school someplace, and obviously later on I found out that he'd spent quite a bit of time studying what he did. He was wearing a ski mask, he was wearing gloves, he never left fingerprints, he didn't leave his weapon behind in my case, he did in another case. But he had obviously taken notes to know what to do to keep me from identifying him, supposedly, but he had the right words, but he didn't know how to sing them, if you know what I mean. He didn't have it all squared away.
So he had gone to crime college?
That's right.
Prison had taught him?
That's right.
Let me go back to Donna Cuomo. How did Willie Horton kill your brother Joey?
Willie Horton robbed my brother Joey, who was working part-time at a gas station. He was a student at the vocational high school, and he stabbed him 19 times.
Joe, isn't it possible that some cons should never be released early? Will you grant us that?
Yes, I believe that. I do believe that.
In your case, and I'm not going to pick on you because I'm pleased that you came here, that you had the courage to be here, to sit there like a man and to talk about this issue. But in your case, arrested, convicted of aggravated assault, you get parole, you go out, you commit another aggravated assault and a burglary. Obviously, you weren't ready to be released. I mean, isn't that fair to say?
No, not really. I don't feel that way.
Well, how'd you screw up? What happened?
I don't feel that way. I was a victim. I was a victim of a crime a few times. The first time I was 6. The second time I was 11. All right, and the third time just recently.
Well, what does that have to do with the fact that you're in jail for aggravated assault and you committed another one? How soon after you got out?
3 years.
Should you still have been in prison? And therefore, one person at least would have been saved an assault and a burglary?
I don't feel that. I feel that, I committed a crime, right? I was wrong. And I did my time. And that's it. I paid for my crime. I paid for it. I just feel I did what I had to do.
Jack, you took a life. Let me go to Jack. You took someone's life, right, Jack?
Right.
You committed murder.
Correct.
The worst crime anyone could commit.
Mm-hmm.
Should you have been released?
In my particular case, I think so, yes. When you consider the fact that my background in the beginning wasn't conducive to crime, and that after I got arrested and did all my time, I still didn't participate in the criminal activities in the prison that I was in, and that I did everything that I could to make myself parole qualified, then yes, I think that I should have been paroled.
But this is one point that Lauren made, and this is one I'm going to raise. We've got to take our first commercial break. But I want everyone to consider this. In prison, there's not a lot of things going on. There's not a lot of good things going on. There's not a lot to occupy an inmate's time. But there is one thing that they can do. They can study the system. They can study how to qualify for early release. They can study how to present the best image and to, pardon my expression, con the officials. Be little choir boys and then get out on the street, commit another aggravated assault, commit a murder, stab somebody 19 times, or go out and rape somebody 9 times. That's one thing I want you to ponder. There are articulate defenders of the system as well as opponents, and we'll hear from both sides in 2 minutes. Stay with us. board. You heard the discussion up until now, perhaps more relevant, you heard the statistics that indicate that nationally, approximately 35% of people paroled are recommitting crimes or violating the conditions of their parole, getting put back in prison. Why shouldn't this system be completely overhauled? Why shouldn't early release be, if not abolished, then severely restricted?
Geraldo, I need to just comment on something first. I'm not on the parole board. I'm involved in the supervision end of parole. I work for the Department of Corrections in New Jersey, so that I'm not involved in the decisions to release people, although I am familiar with the issues involved. Why shouldn't the system be overhauled? I think that the supervision end of the system should be such that you can ensure the public that if you're going to return 35% of the people to prison, that you should be able to ensure that the returns to prison will be for technical parole violations long before there's been an instance of a new crime. I think that the reality is that everybody who goes to jail doesn't stay in jail. And when society is willing to do that, then of course we will have no need for some form of community supervision subsequent to prison. I think the issue is that since everybody gets out at some point, whether serving 3 years on an 8-year sentence or 8 years on an 8-year sentence, I think that the issue is that you want to ensure that those people come out to some kind of community supervision, which is quality, credible supervision, and we're starting to see some of that now nationally, some changes in the way people are supervised.
Catherine?
I agree with that statement. I think we all realize that people are going to re-enter society, and we have to look at what's happening in our correctional facilities in terms of drug treatment, how are we treating sex offenders. But there's another very important part, is what is the victim's role in that parole release interview or hearing? And what is the victim's role at the time of sentencing? When we talk about releasing very serious offenders into society, we want to know a little bit about that offender's history and the impact of that crime on the victim and the victim's family. That's why it's very important for notifying, there has to be a notification procedure for victims so they can give a statement so their interests can be represented.
Let me go back out to Portland, Oregon. Lauren. In John LaCrosse's parole hearing, to the best of your knowledge, were any of his prior crime victims present? Were any of them notified that he was about to be granted parole, that he was about to be set free to rape you and 8 other women?
Not that I know of. I'm not familiar with what they, whether they told anybody before he came out that he was on the way out.
Donna,
they certainly didn't call me.
Right, Donna. Did anyone, as far as you know, in South Carolina, any victims of Willie Horton have a chance to say, don't let this man out before he was free to kill your brother Joey in Massachusetts?
No, not to my knowledge, Geraldo. I recently formed an organization, actually 2, an anti-crime committee and a victim services organizations in my brother's memory. He was murdered 15 years ago, October 26th, and we went back to the garage where he was murdered, and it was very hard, but it was important because it got the attention of the people. And we have filed 2 pieces of legislation, and one is the victim notification, and the other one is open records, because that's why we were not aware of what Horton's record was, because we have a secrecy law in Massachusetts. So those are 2 of the things that we've started, and it's very, very important.
Geraldo, can I interject something?
Go ahead.
In New Jersey, we have a very active victim witness component that I'm aware of at the State Parole Board, and that victims are encouraged to come in and be interviewed by the Parole Board and give their account and their side of the story and how the crime impacted upon them. It's a confidential statement, and that statement is given to the Parole Board for them to review in making a consideration to release somebody on parole or not. And that's a major step forward, I think, over the last several years in New Jersey. The difference
between that and victim notification, a law, that this comes from California, California already has it, is it would be a law that they would have to notify the victims, not just we encourage you to come in.
All right, let's go to Louise. Your daughter, Denise, 27 years old. Her girlfriend, Wendy, in prison, marries Juan Vargas. Is that the way it happened, more or less?
Yes, Geraldo.
All right, so did you all know that Juan Vargas was a parolee?
Well, she married him in prison. Denise met Wanda when they were about 2 years old in the church that we're actively involved in. And Wanda takes epileptic seizures, and as a result, didn't have a lot of friends. Denise befriended her, and they became as sisters over the years. When Wanda went to prison and with another friend to visit somebody, Naturally, Juan showed his attentions to Wanda, and next thing you know, they were married. He was released after serving 6 of 12 years for killing a cop's brother through what we have in New York as a temporary release program. I feel that was given because of the fact that he married Wanda, and he said, I now have a place to go home to, I have a family. The system felt sorry for him, thought they believed him, and of course, like you said, in prison, they're in controlled environments. Most of them, I'm sure, are on their best behavior. They want to get out of there.
Who wouldn't? It's human nature.
Exactly.
Nobody wants to stay in Attica. Nobody wants to stay in some of these other big houses, San Quentin, wherever.
Right.
All right, so then he lends, or he borrows $20 from
He
you.
was only out for a short period of time, and Denise had gotten paid one day, and she was at a local candy store with another friend that was working. Juan went to her and asked to borrow $20, and she said, I don't have any money with me, my purse is home. She had been at the Vargas' home before that. And so he went back to his wife and said, Denise wants her purse. So Wanda put the purse in a bag. Juan goes back to Denise, and Denise gave him the $20. When friends later walked her home that night, Juan was standing out front with this bag under his arm. He had made his wife put it in a plastic bag. He said, I'm not walking the street with a lady's purse. And the friends were going to walk Denise into the apartment. He said, I'll walk Denise. They went on upstairs, and Wanda's brother was there and said he would like a beer, but he didn't have any money. Denise said, I have money. I just got paid today. So Buddy said, fine, I'll walk you. If you'll buy the beer, I'll walk you for it. With that, Juan said, I'll walk Denise. They got on the elevator. Before they reached the lobby, an argument ensued. We know it was because he had taken all of Denise's money. He had returned to drugs. And unfortunately, Denise, nor Wanda, nor any of Wanda's family or anybody they knew, they should have reported him. I did not know this at the time, because certainly I would have. And
what did he do to your daughter?
well, he drugged Denise from the lobby down the outside ramp of the apartment house. She was screaming for help. Her screams were heard, but when people looked out the window, they couldn't see where they were coming from. And it probably would have been too late at that point anyhow. He viciously and brutally stabbed Denise over 20-some-odd times and then drug her body to the back of the basement in an attempt to hide it. Within 24 hours, he was arrested and confessed to the murder. However, during the trial, New York has what they call, he said he was on drugs and alcohol, and though that is not a defense in New York, it's a mitigating factor. The jury bought his story, and again, for his second murder, he was convicted of second-degree manslaughter. He has now served, in February of 1990, he would have served 5.5 years of the 7.5 to 15-year sentence that he got for Denise's murder. However, in February of 1990, he's now eligible to apply again for a temporary release program.
Denise had a son.
Yes, she left behind a 4-year-old son, William, who we are now raising. And William is knowing that a child's mind, you worry. If somebody murdered my mom, are they going to come after me? So we have this that we're dealing with also.
Let's take a break. People in Amarillo, Texas say that 35% failure is too high and that the system needs to be toughened up?
Yeah, but they also say that y'all are operating under the wrong assumption. You assume that everybody in prison is a Willie Horton or doing time for murder. That's the problem. We have so jammed the prison systems of America up with 17-year-old kids with a marijuana joint in their pocket, or the son of a woman who stole a car and took a joyride, that the prison system can't keep the bad guys in because we have just compressed the system in the penitentiaries with so many other kinds of nonviolent crime, white-collar crime, checks, that sort of thing, that the experts can't keep the bad guys. And it's getting worse. Some observers say that in 15 years, the federal prison system will have 150,000 prisoners. Half of them, between 40% and half of them, will be drug offenses. 3/4 of the drug offenses in the state prisons right now have been for mere possession of drugs. So it's getting worse, and that's the problem, not who makes parole. It's the fact that the experts can't keep the bad guys because we've jammed the system up with 17-year-old kids, with hot check writers.
Jim Baker and Leona Helmsley.
Yeah.
Yes, also, but when you have a murderer in prison, and he's supposed to serve a sentence, at least the minimum, we are releasing him so early. Prior to the murder of my son, December 12th of '81, this young man had committed 40 crimes already. He'd been arrested 40 times already. This is like an education to do what he finally did, which was kill my son. He served 3 3/4 years of a 5 to 10 year sentence for second-degree manslaughter. Now, where do we start?
I'd like to respond to that, Geraldo, if I may. I'm all in favor of truth in sentencing. I think that we need to know. I'm a consumer of the system just like you are. And we need to know when somebody gets sentenced to 12 years what they're going to do right up front. But it's not fruitful to pin that on a parole supervision or a parole system or a parole board, because they are merely applying what the statutes give them in the first place. And that is the problem.
Wait a second. What the statutes give them in the first place. Yeah. Let me go back to Lauren's case. Let's say here's the raper. Here is John LaCrosse, the rapist. John LaCrosse doesn't want to stand trial. He knows he's going to go down. He knows he's going to be convicted. He pleads guilty to what? Aggravated assault.
Precisely.
So instead of facing 50 to 100, he's now facing 2 to 4.
So what's the problem?
Good behavior. The problem is that they're not serving the time.
The problem is that somebody can commit 12 rapes, go to jail for an assault, let's say, as a result of a plea bargain. When that case comes before the parole board to consider whether they should release somebody, they can't look at 12 rapes and the statutory requirements for the time that they would have served on 12 rapes. They have to look at the crime that the person went to jail for, the assault. So plea bargaining plagues the system from the moment it occurs right through to the time of parole.
And that's because the system is so overcrowded that if you don't have plea bargaining, it's going to be like in Texas. You're going to have 10,000 inmates that ought to be in state prison that are doing time in county jail because we've plugged the system up with a whole plethora of little offenses.
I'd like to ask Joe, what particular things were discussed and asked in your parole hearing? And in your opinion, do the ones that are conducting the hearing, do they explore your case deep enough, and do they go into your history, into your situation, and into your attitude deep enough before making the parole decision?
What were the most significant questions you remember them asking you?
Well, they asked me the reason why I committed my crimes. And I told them the reason why I committed my crimes. And, when I was in there, I went to therapy. I went to alcohol because I had a problem with alcohol. I had a serious problem with alcohol. When I committed my crimes, I was under the influence of 2 Manols and alcohol.
In fact, all of Joe's crimes were committed while he was under the influence of some substance.
But didn't the parole board ask that question? That you were...
They did.
They had a propensity to use that stuff?
They asked me.
Yeah. You know, what I don't understand is using this, I just disagree. If you've taken an alcohol, if you are an alcoholic, if you're a drug addict, you have a responsibility as a human being. You cannot use this as an excuse. You mentioned, Joe, that you were a victim, you know, when you were 6, 11, and whatever. How many victims are there that do not become criminals? You know, I don't understand that. I also don't understand why we are letting the violent criminals out on parole. It doesn't make sense to me. Yes, we have to let the first offenders, I totally agree with you about plugging the system. But what is going on in our jail system today is completely outrageous. It's become a revolving door. It's not working, and we do have to revamp the system.
Take a break, sorry. Got a break.
I think the problem is rehabilitation. They're letting people out without them truly being qualified to be let out. I think they're not going through enough to rehabilitate these people, to give them some kind of a training, to do something for them in the prisons, so that when they come out, they don't resort back to the ways before they actually committed their crimes.
Donna?
Geraldo, in talking to prosecutors and law enforcement officers, The solution to the crime problem seems to be being able to put these violent criminals away, keep them in prison long enough for it to be a deterrent. And the way we do that is have them serve at least the minimum sentence, our truth in sentencing. Mandatory sentencing, so you don't have judges being able to give...
Truth in sentencing. I heard a truth in lending. Truth in sentencing.
That's right.
Makes a lot of sense. We should know when a guy gets sentenced or a woman gets sentenced, truth in sentencing, that they're really going to do the time that the judge says they're going to do.
Exactly.
I would like to know if overcrowding is the only reason for early release of these violent criminals, and if so, why do we care if they're overcrowded?
Yeah, stack them like gerbils.
Wait, Lauren?
I said stack them like gerbils.
What do you mean? Now, are you being facetious, or do you really mean that?
I really mean that. I mean, don't we have a point in history where prisoners had to have money for their own food? What's wrong with a work camp? I know there's some kind of constitutional law about that, but I really think that we need to back up and take a look at what we're doing. I mean, why should I work the rest of my life to make sure that jerk is eating steak or potatoes or whatever? Why can't he go out and work it on his own? I mean, this guy's just a two-bit jerk.
I'd like to ask Joe, the fact that you're in society now...
Where's Jack? We haven't talked to Jack for a while.
Who's
Still
Jack?
here.
He's right back there. Good.
Oh, Jack.
Right.
Okay, the fact that you've been let out into society now, are you in a rehabilitation program now?
Other than parole and other than the job that I have, which is supervising parolees, not supervising, just making sure that they get the services that they need, no. Speaking about parole and why you parole violent criminals, there are, from what I hear, people are saying that if they're violent, don't let them out. Never let them out. If you do that, you abuse the people that are really trying to get out. And I just heard Mario mention the word rehabilitation. In the rehabilitation mode, you will reach a peak in that rehabilitation. You slide along that peak for a while, but if you have no incentive to do the right thing, then you're going to slide off that peak. And when you slide off that peak, where do you slide to? And the people that are really trying need to have some kind of incentive to keep on trying.
But what about this, Jack? What about what Lauren said? Why should we care if a person who takes another person's life ever gets out? The walls are thick, the wire is sharp, the guards are professional.
Well, you know what you've just described is Dachau or Buchenwald.
Oh,
Where's
that is
this lady
absolutely
from
not so.
up
How can
here
you?
that wants to
That
put
is
them in there
that
like
is the most
gerbils?
absurd historical analogy I've ever heard.
It's not.
No,
the people in
Hitler
Dachau and
started
Buchenwald were
off
innocent
putting
victims.
enemies of the
He's not an
people
innocent
in
victim. He killed
concentration
somebody.
camps.
53 murderers were given commutations by Governor Dukakis, 28 first-degree murderers and 25 second-degree murderers. And that is not acceptable.
And that is a problem. And I certainly don't defend a system that does something like that. However, there are alternatives, and so you don't condemn a whole concept, whether it be parole, rehabilitation, etc., because of some mistakes that I fully agree with.
Well, I'm not calling for that.
Gotta take a break, sorry.
We're talking about...
You come next.
Troubleshoot.
is illustrated by the lady in the red shirt. What we need to be doing is sending fewer kids and people who don't commit violent crimes to prison. If we did that, then the Willie Hortons could be kept until they're aged enough to where a parole board could make a reasonable decision about whether to let them out or not. But the system is really worse than you all even know. It's broke. In Texas, we're turning them out just as fast as we put them in because it's just too crowded. Now, one other thing. I don't think that lady really feels that you want to treat humans the way that those humans treated their victims. And that's what she's wanting to do. She's wanting to make prisoners victims. And I
hear a lot of why nots out there.
In Massachusetts, life with no parole, you still have your life. It's a lot more than my brother had. What we have to do is we have to keep these people in jail for a certain length of time so it's a deterrent. We're not saying no parole, we're not saying no furloughs and reintegrating them back into society once they become eligible for parole, but not paroled in a heck of a lot less time than they're supposed to be. That's where truth in sentencing comes in. The next thing is eliminate plea bargaining. It's been done in Alaska and Michigan, and it puts responsibility back into the system, and that's another important thing that has to be changed.
I must, it sounds great, but I must say I can't imagine, as a former criminal law attorney myself, what 100 Center Street, the criminal court building, would be like in this town without plea bargaining. I mean, that's not to say these aren't bad people, violent people who should be behind bars. But I'm telling you, Rikers Island they'd have to forget about Rikers Island and start on Long Island and make that the penal colony.
Just about everything that was said here today was in regard to the criminal. And the criminal, a couple of people said, make sure he gets everything that he should have. What about the victims? I think at this stage in time, we need a victims' rights bill, a constitutional amendment that will bring us a viable victims' rights bill. And we don't need it, we need it today. We don't need it next year, it has to come as soon as possible. And only the people can get it going, and we should do it right now.
Were you yourself involved in a violent crime?
Yes, I am. I'm the father of a murdered son. My son was murdered in 1985 in Queens, New York. And my family and I are still, and we will the rest of our lives, feeling this very, very heart-aching thing. But these people are still alive and living good. My son is no longer living.
Geraldo, I would like to just add to that. I think we have to increase the public's confidence in the criminal justice system. And too often now, the crime victim enters that system seeking justice and is turned away in total disappointment and frustration. So I think if we make the offender accountable not only to society at large, but also to the victim, and that may mean alternatives to incarceration also in terms of restitution and fines, and that the prison should be isolated for violent felony offenders. But what's happening is the victim is not part of that process, is not treated with dignity, respect, is not informed, and is not a real participant in the system. And that has to change.
Your question.
To comment. My husband's a police officer, and he comes home and tells me that before he's even finished with the arrest paperwork, the person's on the street, and he keeps arresting the same ones over and over again. It's like unbelievable.
Be right back.
Think of your hands and think of a name. For years, it's healed and restored rough, dry skin. Now there's something more. Announcing new, improved Vaseline Intensive Care. An even better formula with more healing ingredients. It heals rough, dry skin fast. So when you think of your hands, think of our name. New, improved Vaseline Intensive Care Lotion. Now with even more healing ingredients.
For ex-offenders out there who may need some help, the Fortune Society here in New York, 29 West 19th Street in New York City. As I mentioned, 10011. There's their phone number. If you're out there, you're thinking, well, whatever you're thinking about, give them a call. 212-206-7070. It's a fine organization. On the other side of the coin, if you're a victim, parents of murdered children and other survivors of homicide, 100 East 8th Street. B41, put that after the street address, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45202. There's their phone number, 513-721-5683. Drop them a line. They'll help you out. Be right back.
If you're overweight, USA Diet is here to help. With USA Diet...
I had a lot of family members who were victims of crime, especially murder, heavy-duty crime.
I don't know. And I'm sure that it would change and alter someone's perspective. Take a shot, Jim Bob, of the victims in the first row and of Louise, Lauren, and Donna. The one point that has to always be borne in mind is that regardless of what happens to the criminal, in these cases the murderer or rapist in these cases, these folks, these victims, are serving life sentences without parole. These victims are branded with this crime committed against them or their loved ones, and there's no board that they can go to make it better. Now, I'm going to lose the satellite to Portland. The bird's going to go down in just a couple of minutes, so even though we're not at the end of the program, I'm going to ask Lauren right now, when we still have her, for her final thoughts on the topic we've been discussing.
Well, Geraldo, I mentioned some rather strong ideas about not being so concerned about the amenities in the prison, and allowing them to work and perhaps get some personal pride or self-esteem or some skills by working and feeding themselves, maybe feeding the community. They could be very helpful in taking care of the needy people, for instance. I'm also going to be counted very harshly by some numbers of you. I'm very much for capital punishment, because once they become a mad dog, what do you do with a mad dog? You shoot it. And I know that this will raise a lot of problems. This is a very emotional comment from me. But why are we being so gentle? And why are we going out of our ways for them? And what's wrong with a victim? I mean, do I have bad breath or something? What's wrong with taking care of us first?
That's a hard place to put either Mario or Selden in, but I'll let either one of you guys jump in then.
Well, I am the bearer of bad news, because it's going to get worse instead of better. It's going to get worse instead of better. There are going to be more guys like Willie Horton. It's going to get worse, worse, worse until we change the focus and spend our money on things that work, like prenatal care, teenage pregnancy, things of that nature. You can't build enough prisons. Texas has tried and is failing. The federal government is going to try, and they're failing. It's not working. You're going to have to do something different. I don't know what it is.
Be right back.
For transcripts, please send $3 to Journal Graphics, Geraldo Transcripts, 267 Broadway, New York, 10007. Or call 212-227-READ.
There have been a lot of suggestions and forecasts ranging from very grim to somewhat more optimistic about the future. There's one thing, though, I think that both sides in this discussion have absolutely no question about, and that is the victim notification bill that California has passed and that the rest of the nation really should. There's no reason in the world why a crime victim, survivor of a homicide victim, shouldn't be notified and have the ability to be at the parole hearing to say, wait a minute, he may be presenting a nice appearance now, but I remember 5, 10, 15 years ago when he murdered my little boy or my brother or my loved one, he wasn't so nice. You must take the victim's feelings into account. So write your state, local legislators, let them know your feelings on that issue. Jack and Joe, good luck to you guys. Selden, Mario, thank you so much. Catherine, Donna, Louise, Lauren, you're great. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.